Can we get another round for Walter? Quite amazing. That was amazing. What a remarkable performance. So welcome to the panel, Learning from Social Movements. This afternoon, I will be facilitating it. My name is Ben Eltham. I'm a journalist and a writer, as introduced to many of you yesterday. We're just going to, get straight into it, basically. So the idea of this panel, I was asked by the Arts Front organisers to put a panel together that looked at what could the people in our community learn from people in other communities, in other parts of social movements who've been working for change, people who've had a lot of experience organising and campaigning. And so I tried to talk to some people and put together a list of some people that I thought might be really useful to come and have a chat to us about that. And so I'm very pleased to introduce today's panel. On my left, we have Louise Tarrant. Louise is formerly of United Voice. I believe you've now stepped down or retired. She's one of Australia's most respected unionists, I think that's fair to say. And she's been involved in social movements for most of her life. She's also involved in the very interesting A24 movement, which we might talk a bit about today, which is a kind of, I guess, cross-social movement kind of thing. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's looking to address some of the big picture issues in our society, like neoliberal economics, like unfair power structures, inequality in our society, and I think it's a very, very interesting model. So thanks to Louise for coming today. To my right, we have Patrick Simons from Yes to Renewables. Yes to Renewables is a campaign, obviously, about renewable energy, and it's part of Friends of the Earth. And Patrick's been working on Yes to Renewables for several years, and I think I can say that I think it's been a very successful campaign. And certainly the take-up of renewables is proceeding apace, driven both by economics and by social change. But also I think you guys have had a very big win recently with the Victorian Renewable Energy Target. So well done with that. So thank you, Patrick. To my far right, or should I say my alt-right, we have... No, just jokes, just jokes. We have Tim Lyons. Tim is the former Assistant Secretary of the ACTU, and he's currently a research fellow at the think tank Capita. And Tim is someone who has written extensively on unionism and the future of work, and I'd point you to his fine recent essay on this issue in Meanjin, I think it was, wasn't it? Yes. So thanks to Tim for coming along. The idea basically was to look at how can we address some of the issues that affect us both as artists and people who make culture, but in fact address issues that affect all of us as citizens in a society. And so what I wanted to do was, I suppose, kick off by just chatting to the panellists in a fairly informal and discursive manner, and then we will have questions from the floor. So save them up, please. We're going to try and get as much of a debate and a dialogue going as possible. But I think I'll address my first question to Louise, and that is maybe to ask you a little bit about A24, and if you can sort of talk a bit about what that thing was, and particularly what A24 is looking to address, because it's, I think, developed quite an interesting and sophisticated critique of neoliberalism in our society.
Okay, so, and let me just say what a privilege to be part of, sorry.
Can we turn these mics on? Are they on?
Hello, is that working?
Just needs to be closer.
Okay, I'll do my rock star imitation. Just wanted to acknowledge what a privilege it was to sit in and be part of that performance with Walter. I feel a very special moment, so thank you. So A24 is, it's essentially not an organisation, it's a conversation. It's a conversation group that we're hoping to grow. And it's born basically out of defeat and despair and frustration and all those sort of negative emotions that many of us have been feeling for some decades now in thinking about how we can have a more just and sustainable world. And we feel like every fight we're on the back foot, we're very siloed in our fights. So, you know, we've got environmental activities going on in one space, social justice somewhere else, workers' rights, arts funding, whatever the issue, but we tend to be very siloed, and that's quite a deliberate strategy, I think, by the forces that actually want to keep us separate. And so we started to bring people from very different movements and individuals together over the last 2 years, having a series of very deep conversations about what drives us. Are we still passionate about the things that we care about? But have we lost ambition to actually make the world a better place? Have we just sort of given up or given in to the fight and not actually tried to think about a transformative future? And so what we're trying to do as a very small group at the moment is grow that, and part of that is next year we have a whole lot of volunteers that are looking to go out and engage a much deeper conversation about what a transformative future would look like, where people and planet are at the centre, and how do we win that. And one of the key elements of that we're very keen on, and so, you know, I'm going to very you know, I guess cynically use this platform today to encourage you to participate in. We want an arts, framing to that, because we actually think the way you tell stories, the way Walter told his story today, is critically important. And so we don't think there's a people story being told in all its manifestations. Rather, it's a story of capital and power that, you know, we need to change. And so we're very keen to look for new partners in that conversation to try and really change the direction this country's heading in.
Thank you. Maybe I'll ask Tim to perhaps carry on with that conversation. One of the things that we address when we talk about these kind of big picture issues, I think, is that we often use quite abstract words like inequality or justice, perhaps even. And there often seems to be a disconnect between talking about these big picture issues, you know, this kind of society we want to live in, and then how to actually make that change happen at the grassroots. And Tim, you've written about that, the challenge, you know, both in terms of organising change, affecting political change, but also what that looks like in terms of on the ground social organising.
Yeah, well, there was a bit in that question.
Yeah. Take whatever you like.
Probably a couple of PhDs in that. So I think, you know, one of the things is there is an abstract conversation which is about concepts like inequality, and it's difficult to motivate people to actually take action and organise in their communities around abstract concepts. What people take action about is things which they understand to affect their lives. And I think this is something where the arts can play a role because of that point about storytelling that Louise was making about actually the community reflecting itself and hearing its own stories back. And so I think part of what needs to occur is actually, as much as we need the ambition that Louise talked about, actually starting with some small wins where you organise around issues that actually speak very clearly to people's direct interests is something that needs to occur in unions and social movements more generally. It's harder to get people to go for an abstract thing, and I think the climate movement has kind of struggled with that. And I think even if you look at, if you think back to when we had the big drought, for those of you that are Melburnians, that there was a real peak in community acceptance of the need to do something about climate change because we were on stage 3 water restrictions, because people were experiencing the reality of climate change, and that sort of ebbed away. But doing things which speak to people's direct economic interests immediately is a lesson which unions have been trying to learn for a long time. And only the most obvious one is to actually stop talking about things like institutions, and including unions, and actually start talking about what these institutions are for, their purpose, what they actually deliver for a society. So I spent a number of years trying to get people to, in the unions, to shut up about talking about unions and actually talk about things like penalty rates, weekend rates, because they actually mean something to people. You know, getting Sundays off or getting paid more because you work Sunday is a meaningful thing for people in terms of their family lives and their incomes. You can motivate people to do things around that. You can organise around that and build something bigger in a way that you can't by just talking about an abstract sense of fairness in the IR system, for example.
So penalty rates is one example of a small win. What sort of other small wins can we think about along those lines?
Well, look, Louise's point about going backwards means there's an almost unlimited number of those that you could do, right? But I think if you thought from my neck of the woods of thinking about the labour market issues constantly, a range of things stand out other than just penalty rates. The first is Australia has essentially decided to have a whole series of low-wage service jobs, including large numbers covered by Louise's old union, that I still do some work for, done by temporary migrant labour or international students, and we've decided that we're going to turn a blind eye as a society to those people being essentially placed outside the industrial protections regime that applies to everybody else. This is the 7-Eleven thing, right? And essentially all of those, a huge part of our labour market is just exempted from the conditions that the rest of us would intend to do. Now, there is a real capacity, I think, for organising around that, because there is a community of interest. It's widely and deeply felt. It speaks to something, the residual broad support for egalitarianism and fairness that we've still got in our society, that you could actually, pick something up without making those people victims. The way you've got to do that, and I'm really passionate about this, is not to present a whole series of poor put upon victims that we need to protect as a society, but as those workers standing up for themselves and having a reciprocal arrangement with allies that are also trying to move a similar piece of work. And people have their own examples, but to me that one stands out. If you think about, I'm sure many of you have read at least some of those stories about the way those workers in places like 7-Eleven are treated. I mean, it is a national disgrace.
It's good, I think, that we're talking about things like wages and pay rates and penalties and things like that, because I think it brings up an issue that doesn't often get talked about in discussions about the arts and culture, which is the fact that we as artists and people who make culture are also, we work. So that there is a labour aspect to culture, there's cultural labour. And in fact, many of the things that happen in the cultural industries in many ways a thin end of the wedge for other industries. So the arts is one of the most casualised industries, for example. It's one of the industries most dominated by freelancers and people who are paid literally from gig to gig. I mean, that's where the phrase comes from, is our own industry, the gig economy. And I think that it's really important for us to start talking about these labour issues in culture. And I was hoping to maybe ask Tim and Louise, how will we go about organising in this industry in which people are so disconnected and in which there are so many, people who don't even see themselves as workers often?
It's interesting when I'm trying to get my head around where work is moving to, and particularly with automation, there's going to be a radical transformation of how work happens within the next decade or so. And you already see that with the fragmenting of rights that Tim's talked about for a lot of quite powerless workers. One of the interesting things is that they talk about the new Hollywood economy. So I think it's a really, direct analogy in that they talk about Hollywood being a sort of the ultimate economy that they would like, because it's an example of people coming together with disparate skills at a moment in time to create a very, discrete product and then going off and reassembling somewhere else in a different pattern, and as if, that's the best way to organise labour. And, in all of that, people are well paid. And now what they failed to talk about, which I'm not telling any of you, I'm sure, is that there might be a few people in that economy that do very well, but for a lot of actors and people that service the arts in that particular industry, they're probably working waitressing at the weekend to pay for their love of that craft. It's fascinating that that's the model of the future of work. And so I think, the answer is twofold. There's an immediate response that says, look, you're more powerful when you collectivise. It doesn't matter what you call it. It doesn't have to be called a union. It doesn't have to be a traditional structure. When you get together and share a voice and share an analysis of what's going on and tell stories and, stand together, you're much stronger. And so, there are models around. The Freelancers Union in the States is a very interesting model of where people have collectivised. And, that's around services, so their insurance and some of their legal sort of rights, and as well as some of their information and bargaining. So there are models around. But I think ultimately we've got to take a bigger picture. The issue is that this is a trend for the whole labour market. Unfortunately, you're the cutting edge of some of the bad parts of the labour market. And so I think we need a very different approach to thinking about work in the future. I think we've got to talk, and I'm not sure if people are familiar, but there's the early stages of debate around a universal basic income, which is a guaranteed economic payment to every citizen in a society. What are the new prescriptions that we need to organise around and for that changes the nature of our society, because work will not be the intrinsic economic basis for people's lives in the future. And so how do we organise around that? So, sorry, that's going from the very immediate to the bigger picture.
So, just a couple. As someone who makes part of their living as a freelance writer, I feel your pain, and sort of personally experience that. So, I think the way I describe this is that we've got a series of the way we regulate work, and the way we tax work, and the way we have our benefit system structured, is actually all predicated around an economy which has either disappeared or is disappearing fast. So our industrial relations system is very good at regulating car factories, and by next year we won't have a car factory. It doesn't regulate the sort of work that anybody in this room does very well. It doesn't speak to the way we work. It doesn't speak to the power relationships we have with those that engage us. It doesn't speak to security of hours and income and engagement. And as Louise said, that's a pattern that's replicated not just in what I think in all forms of knowledge work, whether it's creative, whether it's artistic, creative or not, but also increasingly across a range of the service economy and even parts of the traditional blue-collar economy. And so there is a big picture there to be seized where by people starting to organise in their own industries around what are the things we can do for ourselves to collectivise money and power to make our own lives easier. That's one thing that we do together. But that actually then starts to inform what are the public policy changes that would actually have things like the way we regulate work changed in a way that makes sense to the way we actually work, right? I mean, if you're a Foodora rider, you have a fundamentally different set of issues than most of the transport workers for whom the Transport Workers Award is structured around, right? It just doesn't work. And that gets replicated across. But the main thing is for people who have a commonality of interest to start to work together to build power and then start to have that add up to an ask on the broader political economy.
Pat, I was in a session earlier this morning where we were talking about campaigning, and I think it's really great that you were able to come along today, because what I wanted you to maybe help us out with is just actually what campaigning looks like on the ground. What's that process like? Give us a bit of a snapshot.
Yeah, sure. So first point I'll make is what Tim was talking about before, about kind of taking those abstract ideas and bringing them down to something concrete. So that's like a really important thing. So with Yes to Renewables, we're basically a climate campaign, but we work on renewable energy and why that is good for communities, and why that is good for workers, and why that is good for the climate. So telling that broader story. In terms of what that actually looks like, we use a lot of social media. So when I wake up in the morning, it's often check Twitter first, make coffee. What is the shadow renewable energy minister whinging about today? And just kind of developing those habitual kind of, checking the news, checking Twitter, and then, getting organised through our network of grassroots activists to to respond to those issues. But yeah, I work at Friends of the Earth, which is on Smith Street in Collingwood. It's been described as a bit of a, an apprentice mechanic workshop for campaigners. It's pretty messy. There's papers everywhere, but that's the headquarters. So a lot of time analysing media and social media. Part of that is that we don't have a lot of money, but we do have access to tools like Twitter, Facebook, blogging, where we can get our message out. The other aspect is a lot of solidarity work. So, speaking to groups like the unions, if we're going to say renewables are good for jobs, what are we going to be trying to deliver that is genuinely good for jobs? We don't want to just talk about, environment groups can't just talk about jobs and why environmental change is good for jobs, but we've got to actually put that into action. So kind of, doing a lot of solidarity work with unions, other community organisations, meeting with those groups, coming back together as our kind of like our own network and developing an ongoing strategy for media, for lobbying. I hope that's a very quick summary.
No, we will continue, I think. But I'm going to mention while we're talking social media, there is an Arts Front hashtag for those of you who are tweeting along, which Tim has just used. Thank you, Tim. Do hashtag your tweets so we can follow the thread. What about this network of grassroots activists? Where do they come from? How do you get them, and how do you keep them?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question, actually. So, Yes Renewables is actually a really small group of dedicated people. We meet every week. A lot of the people involved are students, but from all walks of life. We've got people who might be in the corporate sector, students, people who are paid activists, some people who work in the community sector, so quite broad in terms of the background. We meet up once a week and we discuss the main issues, and we talk about our strategy, we evaluate what we're doing and the actions that we're taking as part of like a long-term strategy. You mentioned our campaign for the Victorian Renewable Energy Target. That's something that we worked on as a small group for about 3 years. So just that kind of habitual being part of a group, coming together, having a shared vision, developing tactics and actions together, that's really the core part of what we do. But also just developing those connections with the broader set of people, who benefits from renewable energy is the place that we start. And that's why doing work and reaching out with community organisations in regional areas, or to allies in the union movement, or wherever you can find someone who is connected to what you're doing, who may be able to benefit for some way, and drawing on those resources.
What about technology? Do you have like a whiz-bang kind of back-end blog or wiki or something that helps you run your campaigns?
Nothing fancy, to be honest. Yeah, just we use Facebook a lot to communicate. Nothing too high-end or technical. So, using the tools that are readily at your disposal is really good if you're trying to bring people into your campaign. Facebook is so important. It's where everyone spends a lot of their time. So we use that to communicate with each other a lot. So I would say that, demystifying the kind of tools of campaigning is important. A lot of the tools are quite simple and most people can use them. And then in terms of getting the message out, things like blogging is I guess another step. If we can't get a story into The Age or into online media for whatever reason, we can put it on our blog and we can put it out on social media, and that can generate quite a lot of traction that way.
Well, maybe this is a good time to start talking to them. Yeah, go.
I'm really passionate about this particular distinction. There's a difference between campaigning and organising. Campaigning is something you do to affect one particular outcome, right? So change a government decision, not get this building knocked down and turned into flats, whatever, right? It's fine and it's got an important place in our society. Organising is something you do to build permanent power, right? So it's the difference between a social movement, which permanently changes the way a society works, and trying to influence the outcome of something like an election, which is a very temporary thing. So you've got to decide what it is that you actually want to do. Without putting an ad up, I had a piece in Eureka Street last week about solidarity and about collective action. And one of the things about solidarity is people can actually just forget how to do it, right? And if people don't see it in their own societies or their own communities, then it's not something that people reach naturally for, to have a collective response to a problem. It's learned behaviour, and people learn through doing it, and they learn through winning, which is something that we've talked about, Louise, with groups of workers we were trying to organise for 20 years. But it's true, and it's true for those organising conversations you might try and have with workers, or with you and your fellow people in the arts community or our broader community, is actually have a sense, if people see others doing things together, they get a sense that it's possible. It gives them permission to try it as well and to join in. And so that sense, that campaigning stuff's really important, but a sense of actually doing things collectively together to influence that outcome, even if your initial successes are relatively minor, has a way that kind of builds its own momentum. And I think you have to, we didn't get where we are now overnight. We're not going to change it all back overnight. But starting a really, almost a slow burn of renewing the centrality of solidarity and collective action to what it means to be human actually is a really important thing for us to do. And every one of us has got a role to play in doing that in our communities, in our professions, and in our work environments. Sorry, that's a bit of evangelical, but that's, to me, the actual issue that we've got.
Can I add too, I guess, I spent most of my life in the union movement, and so I come from having an organisational base, and now I'm an activist in a voluntary organisation, and it's very different. You just can't write the cheque the way you used to. But it's also taught me lots of very good things as well. But I just think so in terms of your original question, which is how do you sustain grassroots activity, and particularly, given this conference and maybe some of the sort of future directions people want to take in your community, where you may not have a lot of resources. So how do you maintain organisation in that? And I think there are a couple of, elements to that. I think, you've got to build momentum. I think that's one of the killers that I found is that, you've got to have energy being pumped in. You've got to have key milestones so that people have a sense that there's something to work towards. It's not just seamless. And you've also got to have I think, a real sense of defining victories as you go, because these are very long fights, and if you just wait to win at the end, it's a long time between drinks. So it's how do you define the victories as you go, and how importantly do you build trust in relationships, because at the heart of organising and maintaining solidarity is connection. And so it is about building trust, and so it's a lot of relationship work, which often we, in organisations, you can tend to ignore because, you buy in expertise or you just tell people to do things. But finally, I think at the end of the day, people get involved, and I take all the things that have been said on the stage, absolutely people respond to things that are tangible and within life's grasp. But what really motivates them is when that connects to a much larger story about their lives, their kids' lives, their communities' future. And so it is about connecting the small to the big. And that's what turns campaigning into organising, because ultimately you're linking the funding fight today with a transformation about how culture is seen in our community, or it's about trying to rewrite stories about what defines us as humanity versus markets, or it is about connecting the small to the big, I think.
Let's talk a bit about those connections and that idea, trust. It seems to me that modern society and indeed modern economics is very corrosive of trust, that we seem to be less trustworthy of our fellow human beings than certainly than I can remember in my adult life. And you know, it does worry me, I think, what seems to be happening well, certainly in US politics, but it's bigger than just the US. There seems to be a general turning away from, you know, our fellow human being, I think. It does worry me that to some degree that this seems to be related to the fact that our social media networks are increasingly filtered, and that, you know, that people talk about this idea of the filter bubble. Is that something that you guys have looked into? I mean, is that something that concerns you?
So, look, I think trust is an absolute core value for cohesion in any society. And, you know, I think when you have a dominant economic political narrative that we've had in the Western world since the 70s, that is based on a view that we're all competitors in a marketplace, and that imbues every bit of public and private life, then not surprisingly, trust is eroded. Now, scratch the surface and people are fundamentally still about humanity and each other. I actually don't think it goes away. I just think it sometimes gets silted up. And so it's about how you sort of scrape that away and find the trust underneath. So I do think, and I think the corollary to that, and we see it play out in the US, is that trust is also, you know, key in the importance to public institutions like democracy, like parliament, like, you know, the sorts of institutions that help keep a society cohesive. And we've been taught to distrust politics. We've been taught through a market prism not to trust in our own institutions, and that's partly right, because our own institutions have done the wrong thing. You know, politics has not looked after the interests of people over markets by and large. So, you know, there is a real trust deficit, and without trust, I don't think you can have really long, deep, meaningful and ultimately successful collective activity. But I also think it's there. I think it's just a matter of, you know, is the right the people, you know, the right that actually collectivise that, or is it progressives with the sort of values that are about social justice, that are about humanity, that are about culture and about, you know, sort of new ways of doing things? That's the contest that I think we're right in the fulcrum of, and that's why I think it's a really exciting time for all the, you know, depression of Trump. You know, it is actually now. It's a real fight now.
Yeah, shit's getting real. There's no doubt about that. Did you want to?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. Yeah, I think that those are all really important points, and I think when it comes to trust, sometimes one of the most important things is reaching outside that bubble, and it's sometimes the scariest work is speaking to people who aren't like you. And actually that's sometimes where some of the more important work happens, and it can come down to a really personal level, just you know, developing those personal relationships, some from a different area or a different industry, different political background, someone with quite different views. And, you know, if you work together on something over time and achieve something, that can become really solid, and then who knows what you're going to do with that next. Then the other side of it is telling that story as well. So doing the real personal work, but also getting that out there in the media to change people's perceptions around, you know, are we really that divided?
Yeah, so there's no question that the kind of marketisation of society has meant an atomisation thing goes on, right? And people are encouraged to regard everybody else as their competitor. Even those of you that have had the misfortune to work in large government departments or corporations, even the teams are sort of encouraged to actually fight amongst themselves for who gets the most performance pay. It's this kind of, even when you're a team, you're not really a team, you're really still all competing against each other. That sense of things being a collective project, which I think is actually a bit of a natural human instinct, has been eroded by that marketisation and by the collapse of institutions. And so that's what the right have done. But I actually think, this isn't shared by everybody on the left, but my own view is that the left have done their own bit. We've made our own contribution to that by always reaching for a government intervention to be the solution. And many of the history of the most successful social movements and institutions in civil society are actually things that people do for themselves, right? And so rediscovering a sense of what it means to be political and what it means to be collective in terms of trying to build, and that's what the original trade unions were and the original collectives and cooperatives, were exercises in self-help for people to do things together. And those kind of institutions can be, which can be quite anarchic and don't have to be bricks and mortar, they can just be networks of people, are an important way to push back against that current of, well, it's either the market or it's the state that's going to fix everything. And I think, fairly clearly it's not. I'm not sounding very alt-right. Are you disappointed? That was possibly the meanest thing anyone's ever said introducing me, by the way.
I sincerely apologise. Now, on that note...
Tim, do you want to come and sit here?
This is the sort of host I am, you see. I start beating up on my guests before they even talk.
That's right.
Now, I'm cognizant of the fact that there's some very smart people in this room, and so I want to leave plenty of time for questions for the floor. So if there are some questions, let's kick them off, because I think there's plenty of people here that might want to have questions for our panellists. Or not. Yes, sir.
I'll throw one in. Kevin Brennan.
I'll give you the mic.
If you don't use the microphone, the captains can't hear you.
I'll kick it off. I don't think I fall in that category of the smart people in the room, but I'm interested in this issue of alliances because my understanding of working with communities and engaging with communities all over the place is that they have so much support and there are people working in the cultural sector that I really think we're in the majority. We know that most Australian, more people make art than play sport, more people attend arts events than attend sports events. So I think we're huge, but we have the most untapped latent power, I think, of any group in Australia. And I've been doing work with Get Up over the last couple of years, and particularly the last election, and really interested in how those alliances work. So I followed Friends of the Earth, member of Environment Victoria. I go to gigs, we've got Grannies for Asylum Seekers, Environment, I went to the coal closures thing last week, Friends of the Earth, Union People, Youth Climate Coalition, and they're not in competition. These groups are working hand in glove, and it seems in the cultural sector we're not doing that. And in the last election, Get Up, we were helping, Get Up's been credited with being primarily responsible to defeat 4 neo-libs and really decimating Peter Dutton's margin, his electorate, from about 7% to 2%. And they're crediting Get Up with that. So my question, I guess, is this question about building those alliances, because the other thing that Get Up found is it's not, you can have online stuff, but they found the weakness was if it's just online, you're not getting people. Getting people in a room together is not the same. And Get Up are now mobilising to actually have ongoing face-to-face mechanisms on the organising level. So I'm wondering what the lessons are for actually that advocacy and partnerships, whatever you want to call it, that solidarity groups, and how they work and your experiences of those, with the lessons for the cultural sector and maybe reflections on your experience of it. And if that's not too confusing, I'll add in, some of these groups keep saying, how do we get the arts involved? And there seems to be this absolute lack of engagement between arts and other social movements. In terms of the day-to-day, like the rallies, the signage is appalling. You don't get good songs to march along. And yet the arts sector is like almost waiting for an invitation.
What do we want? Better posters? When do we want it?
Yeah, that's right. But, the songs, the
High-quality graphic design.
In my heyday in the 80s, we had it, we had Circus Oz on the back of the truck, we had the bands, we had great chants, we had outrageous stuff. We're not talking at the moment. So just some reflections on that, maybe.
Can I just say, one of the things that I remember really strongly, and I still have, and I was at the a union this morning, and they were showing me one of their banners that came from this period. In the early 90s, there was the Art and Working Life program that the ACTU. And, you know, like I've got this beautiful book that I often go back and look at, which is, and I should send you a copy, Walter. It's a book of poems of cleaners, migrant women who are in the cleaning industry, and it was done as part of the Art and Working Life program. And it talked about, gave those, well, it was an incredibly important act of building solidarity in that group of workers, because over a course of time working with a poet, they were able to share stories, etc., and build trust and solidarity. But also then it gave us a window into these whole other lives. So just that was one little project. But that program across the union movement gave us wonderful banners, it gave us wonderful stories, plays from the Everleigh workshops in Sydney. Like it just, you know, so the power is there. And the other thing I was very lucky to do early in the year, I was at the Brooklyn Art Museum in New York, and they had it was an action art exhibition, and it was how art had been used in all different, you know, from artistic creations showing how poverty and transport intersect in urban areas through to, for me, the most powerful thing was an anti-lynching campaign run in the 30s in the US. And the NAACP, the peak body for African Americans at that time, had no money to run a campaign. So they just basically used the resources of a couple of people who were photographers. And so they built this whole campaign against lynching on these really seminal art pieces of photographic work, and incredibly powerful. So when we bring movements together, there is when we bring culture with small p politics together, it's incredibly powerful. And yet for some reason, and I think it's endemic of our world, that, you know, we're very mechanistic and transactional. We've lost and that's why in A24, and Alex Kelly, I'm waving to, she's online in Alice. You know, Alex Kelly's a key part of the A24 work that we're doing, and she quite rightly keeps pushing us to say this has got to have culture at its heart, because that's how we reflect people's lived experience and tell stories in many different ways. That's the power of how we will win hearts and minds. So, hallelujah, brother.
There's a strong history on Spring White. That stuff about there are a lot of alliances.
I think that there's a lot of artists working for social change at the moment in really innovative areas, and I think that this is an extension of the kids these days arguments. You know, and I think Sam Warman and like the work that he did with unions recently about the closing class. I see great signs at rallies. I think that work is happening in different spaces, and how do we actually foster intergenerational conversation that are less about you guys aren't doing this anymore, and that are more about how can we learn from each other and how can we recognize what we have.
Oh, yes, that's my fault. Sorry.
Just so you know, the captioners can only hear it through the microphone, and people are using the captions. So if you don't speak through the microphone, they can't access what we're saying.
I was just saying, I think that there's lots of examples of artists working for social change, and, you know, thinking of that union movement and the beautiful work that Sam Warman's done. I see great signs at rallies, and I think for me that talking about, you know, what doesn't happen these days, it kind of buys into the intergenerational debate that's been stirred up between us, and how do we actually foster intergenerational alliances and learn from history, and acknowledge that, you know, young people growing up today, we're living in really different circumstances and we express ourselves differently, and just because you may not recognise it, it may be about your cultural lens and less about what we're doing. And so I'd really love to foster meaningful engagement around these issues, because I think that, you know, like the activist and protest movement is alive and well and kicking in Australia and globally.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I agree. I think there is a lot of political art being made at the moment. But whether that political art is necessarily transferring across into the kind of solidarity that some of the panellists have been talking about is perhaps the question. So that is, I think, really interesting, and one that we could all take away from this conversation. Do we have another question? Yes, we do. Claire.
You are going to get me talking, Ben. I have a question. There's been a call. Claire Cooper, hi. Thank you for all your wisdom so far, everyone on the panel. There's been some calls for boycotts and strikes in our sector. I hate using that word. From people, from artists, from festival organisers, saying that it's really important for us to make the absence of what would have happened felt in the next few years. I don't agree with that sentiment because it's asking us to stop creating, in a sense. But I'd really like to hear your opinion on that, on how we can make this gaping hole of non-happenings, of artists that would have perhaps found their way and will not, of young artists that would have had mentorships and do not have art start, all of these things that we can't really measure because they're not going to happen. How do we keep creating but make that absence felt?
Do you want me to start?
Jump in, yeah.
So, look, I think hearing you talk about that, I was reminded about conversations that you have with people like health workers and nurses about having a discussion about withdrawing their labour in order to achieve something. And they're emotionally connected to their work, and they identify as being carers. And the people that employ them exploit that to try and get them to do things which are against their interests. And I think there's a sense in which the emotional attachment to people's work and the emotional attachment to wanting to help other artists is going to play into those sort of decisions in terms of campaigning activities that you might take. The problem that almost every movement trying to change something has is we instantly jump to having a discussion about tactics. We instantly jump to having a discussion about let's have X demo, let's have X action, let's have X strike or boycott or whatever, without any theory of power, without actually any analysis about how that fits into what we're originally trying to do and why it makes sense to do that with this group of people now. Now, I'm not close enough to be able to answer that question. But what I can say is I think the way you ask the question suggests you understand that there's a whole bunch of stuff you need to know before you get to that point, right? You have to understand what it is that you're trying to do, what is your theory of power, how you're going to change the situation you're in, and therefore why it makes sense for this group of people to take this action. And I think that is something that we can learn in the back end from each other about how it works. I actually think the green movement has been, the environmental movement in general, has been much better at this than most of unions for most of my adult life. And I think the fact that green issues have more instantaneous currency in our broader community than workers' rights do, it says that. I think there's more natural sympathy. Corporations jump more if you catch them out doing something environmental than if they are bashing workers, actually, is what happens in our community now. So something the environment movement has done over a long period of time really works that unions have to learn from, and I think other people can. But it's that kind of discipline of keeping focus on what you wanted to do and therefore what action you need to take makes sense that I think we need to have, and that is something we can collectively learn.
Yeah, those are really good points. I think kind of what that speaks to for me is the kind of difference between strategy and tactics, and that's really important. I'm not involved with boycotts so much myself, but just relaying some kind of recent, things that I think are really cool that's happening at the moment and recent conversations. So like the No CUB campaign that's been running, targeting Carlton United Brewery over their treatment of workers has been really impressive to me for a couple of reasons. What's cool, I think, is that they've both targeted the picket line, the circumstances of the workers themselves and the consumer end. So rather than focusing on just one element, they've actually, in a very targeted fashion, cut off both ends. So and just focusing very strongly on that one example of what is the term for the the labour practices, where using labour, like the labour hire companies, that's something that's happening across the board.
Yeah.
But having a very strategic focus upon one entity helps to kind of achieve those broader outcomes. I was recently just at the Listen conference, which is the feminist music conference that was in Melbourne, and just observing, and there was a really healthy discussion there around some of the issues that you mentioned about people who were like, wanting to maybe boycott or call out some crap that was happening in their artistic workplaces, and was feeling that pressure of, I'm doing this on my own. So the importance is having at least a group of people who can support each other through this, if that's something that you choose to do. If it's strategic to have a boycott, hopefully don't do it on your own. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not actually a boycott if you do it by yourself.
Yeah. Good correction.
That's
Yeah, don't try that.
it's an important definitional point there. Do we have another question? Yes, David at the back.
Hi, thank you. David Pledger. I know I'm going to apologise in advance because it's sort of a half-formulated question, so excuse me. But I've been trying to see the last sort of 24 hours through the lens of what happened in the US election. And I'm very interested in what you've been talking about today and the whole idea of building momentum. It seems to me that the greatest momentum, or probably the most dangerous momentum that's building at the moment, is around Brexit and Trumpism. And I'm very interested to hear what you might think about, the notion that the language and the positions and values that, you seem to be largely uniformly connected to and with each other, how they are seen through the lens of those people that are driving that momentum, that shift towards what some commentators are calling is from a neoliberalism to a neo-fascism in Trump's case. And I'm wondering how those that feel disenfranchised and who are not reflected here at this conference respond to some of the things that you're talking about, and how language can help shift and bring them into a position that's not adversarial and not incredibly dangerous, which I think it is at the moment. So yes, I was right, that was a half-formulated question, but forgive me.
Well, it's actually quite a deep question and a difficult one.
And you're probably going to get some half-baked answers, but so as long as you're happy with that. Look, I think, it's the seminal question of our time, actually. So it is, and getting the question right is really important, actually, because I think a lot of people post-Trump have jumped to answers before we've really dug deeply enough to understand what we're trying to understand. From my perspective, if I was a working class person living in, Wisconsin, USA, I wouldn't have voted Democrat. I probably may not even have voted. And yeah, there's something about Trump because he's actually calling the system that's destroyed my life and my family's life. And I think that's how a lot of people saw it. I don't actually think the right in France and England and US owns the hearts and minds of a lot of people. I think what they're doing is they're breaking with conventional politics to show some leadership that people starved of heroes and heroines and, hope. Of hope, that's right, actually are clinging desperately for something, because there are broken systems around the world for a lot of people. And so I think, it's and we're not out there. We are so bloody, safe about what we say. We've forgotten the radical language we had of past decades. We don't offer an alternative that's different. All we do is we try and shape around the edges. Just look at our last election. Pathetic. So it's not surprising that a Hanson or a Trump that actually says, we think this system's broken, we think it's unfair, we think you should do better, corporations are bad. I mean, the fact that Trump's a corporation, let's not have logic. but it's just, it appeals to, I think, a real sense of loss and despair and a desperate need for, people that will shake up the system that is not working for them. So I'm not as despairing, but I do think that if we don't offer that alternative and get our act organised quickly, then yes, it's very much, it's the 30s in Europe all over again.
I was doing something for an education union last week, and so I had to read a bunch of education policy wonkery, and there was a phrase in it which has really struck me as being a good summary of, although it was used in another context, of the situation we face. And this academic described the position that people who didn't like marketised education were in, was they were living under the dictatorship of no alternative. And I kind of feel a bit like that's what, and I hate the term progressive because I think it actually papers over a bunch of differences that are important and we should actually debate, but I'll use it as shorthand, really haven't got a coherent answer to some of those bigger questions about marketisation. And I think as a result, as a series of communities have been destroyed, that lack of hope means people just reach out for the craziest thing that's going because it's actually all they've got. And so, but that does give us an opportunity to actually organise around a genuine alternative and around a sense of hope and possibility. And it still does work. There's a lot of bad stories about the American election, but some good friends of Louise and I who are involved in the Fight for 15 campaign that some of you may have seen in the States, which is essentially a low-wage worker movement focused in fast food in particular to increase the minimum wage. They won referendums increasing the minimum wage in a series of key jurisdictions. And in each of those jurisdictions where they were organising to do that, the turnout of low-wage communities and minority communities was higher. The ballot result for the left of the ticket was better. So the point is you get people in their communities doing things and it almost doesn't matter what, the boat starts to rise. And you get this flow-on effect of people understanding that there is a sense of possibility around organising and doing things in their communities, which starts to contribute to who gets on the ballot as the local candidates, starts to affect your local city council elections, your state elections, whatever. These are complicated societies, and just because we're unsuccessful at one level doesn't mean we need to give up. And as I said, really underneath that US election result, there were some positives there about what we know works in terms of getting people moving in their own interests. And, bugger who runs Washington, we're just trying to get a pay rise in this city, which is actually a perfectly legitimate thing to do, and it changes people's lives. Those jurisdictions where they won that, if they take the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 an hour, think about the difference that has made in people's lives. Transformative. And so part of the trick is looking for the things that we can do to organise around that transform people's lives. And that's how we give them a bit of hope, maybe.
Yeah, jump in, Pat.
I think the other thing, if you're looking at it from the perspective of someone who is, maybe in this context, trying to reach out to other groups, finding champions is really important just to start that first conversation. On this issue of, Trump and the Rust Belt and so on, I sort of think in the context of Victoria, so we have the Hazelwood coal-fired power station, which is, arguably one of the world's most polluting coal-fired power stations and is about to close. There's been a really interesting community organisation doing work there called Voices of the Valley, and that group got started after the Morwell fires. Basically, a bunch of community members who, many of whom weren't political, stood up and just said, this is ridiculous, our community is suffering the ill health effects of coal, and became radicalised they wanted to get organised and do stuff. And so there's been quite a lot of work done with the environment movement, reaching out to groups like that and just building those relationships and working on things together. So finding those people in the places that are feeling the effects of privatisation, finding those groups and starting a project together, working on something and developing those relationships and working on shared values, focusing on the things that you do share rather than the things that you don't share.
I'm just going to give a shout out to my friend Tom Doig, who wrote a book, The Coalface, about that. It's a very fine book, and it's a work of citizen journalism, really. So that's a good reference point for a lot of the stuff that's been happening in Hazelwood. We definitely have time for another question or two. Yes. Hang on a sec. Wait for the mic. Thanks, Nicole.
Hey everyone. It's for your panel today. I've been thinking about a lack of trust and even a lack of a coherent message, particularly in the left, as a way to, as a barrier to achieving that collective action and defining goals. I think there's definitely a disposition among the left to seek and define differences rather than to approach people from a position of acknowledged similarities and shared experiences and values. I think we're more alike than we are dissimilar. Do you think that seeking similarities is a good strategy in achieving goals and moving forward? And how might we do that? Like, approach people from a point of similarity rather than difference?
That's an excellent question, I think.
Yeah, it is.
So I'll have a go. I think it's a great question. And I would agree wholeheartedly about a lot of us have spent our lives seeking difference. It's been interesting actually when we started A24, which was really, a few mates having a chat about we needed to get our act together. We very consciously have kept the invite list for the first 2 years really small because we actually only wanted to bring in people that we knew and trusted in part and people who we felt would actually have an attitude of yes and rather than no but. And so it was actually a really conscious construction of a sort of a diverse group that was free thinking but was still positive. And we now got to think about how we take that large and keep that culture. And so it's not about similarity because I think we want diversity, but it is about, and I think part of this is that we've lost the language of values because that's what binds us. We can have different, Tim and I have had different arguments over the years about different things and that's healthy, that's really good. But we share a set of values and a commitment to a particular sort of sense of humanity. And so I think that it is about us, and it's been interesting in this A24 process, we've actually been talking about what are the values that bind us, and we've actually had to reinvent almost, the values of the 60s or the values of the 40s are not really, some of it's translatable but the language isn't or the resonance is different and it didn't have an ecological focus to it. So and gender wasn't great and racism was really poor, So we've had to really struggle with what are the values helping define that. But I do think that that's really, so it's not about similarities, I think it's about shared essence and then having respectful difference. It's almost as if we, and it's this real binary. You're either for it or you're against it. It's no nuance in our world, and it's the nuance that's important, and that's where you get contestation, and that's healthy. But I think you're right. I think it's absolutely the fault of the left, and that's why we have the fragmentation or people walk away because they don't want to know. People want to be part of something that makes you feel good, and you're moving forward.
There's a very old union slogan. It was, the unity of labour is the hope of the world. This idea that there was a sort of collective thing that bound everybody together that was actually the source of power and was going to win. I think it was a very perceptive question. And I think there's a few drivers here, some of which Louise has mentioned. Large parts of the left political operation in the Western world has been about assembling coalitions. So coalitions of different interest groups and making that add up to enough to win an election. And so there's been a political, and the United States is the most pronounced of this. You add people of colour to Latinos and college-educated white women and the Jewish community on the East Coast and you almost get to a national minority. But that does that add up to any sort of collective project, right? And a sense of common humanity, or is it just a series of interest groups that you need to buy off when you achieve political power? I think organising around a sense of common humanity, in the sense of what politics and our political participation needs to be about, is that democratic politics of the common good. That sense of it's actually a movement where there needs to be some measure of compromise about our own interests, which isn't about giving your own interests away, but about in the end doing things which we need to do as a community and as a group. And if you think about what the bad guys always do to us, is that, you know, we actually have to inspire people with a bit of hope and have a solution, right? All they have to go around doing is tell people who to blame, right? And who to be afraid of. Whether it's, you know, Mexican rapists or Muslims or foreigners in general, or the Chinese economy, or whatever, whatever, Lebanese, third generation Lebanese Australians, according to a minister this week. They want to divide, in particular, generally, poor people and people of colour from everybody else, and kick down. And so we have to be careful that the way we do our natural organising around communities of interest doesn't end up, or doesn't help us in the end fight for the broader things that we need to do as a society. I think we have to be really aware of that, which isn't to collapse difference between people who recognise their interests, but understand that real democratic politics is about a measure of compromise and unity, which can get a bit uncomfortable.
I'm going to give the last word to Pat.
That's going to be really difficult to follow because that was awesome. I think I'll just sort of speak about some of the examples that I know of groups or campaigns that are actually like putting this into practice. Yeah. A very interesting campaign that at the moment, Australia-wide, I think is the Lock the Gate movement. Which, for those who might not know, is about opposing coal seam gas development, particularly on the land of, farmers. And so it is a coalition, largely of environmental groups and farmers and rural communities working together. And so Friends of the Earth worked on this campaign in Victoria, and fortunately, after about 5 years of this work, we managed to secure a ban on unconventional gas, including fracking in this state. So go Victoria. But that took a lot of quite long and deep grassroots work between, urban environmentalists working with regional communities, going out there and building those shared values and making them clear. We want clean water. We want, safe farmland. We want to protect our jobs and protect our farms. And then, the climate stuff was actually like kind of subsidiary to that. And so, finding out what those shared values are and putting them out there strongly and stating them is really important. I think there was something else I was going to add, but it's just slipped my mind, but I'm happy to chat afterwards. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to call it to a close now because we are nearly at 2 o'clock, but I know for me this has been a really stimulating conversation. So I'd like all of us to thank our panellists today. Thank you to Louise, to Pat and to Tim. A little bit of housekeeping. I understand there's a whole bunch of sessions going on now from 2 to 3:30. They're on your program, and I'm sure they'll be on the screen at some point as well. So have a chance to go to some of those other panels. But thanks again for all of your questions. They were really, really interesting. And thanks again for your time and your generosity.
Thanks, Ben. Folks, we're just going to make a really quick announcement before you take off. Feel free to stand if you need to stretch your legs. Thank you so much for joining us at Arts Front. Before I forget, the session that is called this afternoon, 43 and 73, is now moving to run parallel now. So if you're looking for those guys, let's just meet them at reception where the balloons are, into that space. And if you are in one of the breakout rooms that has a laptop and enables a Google Hangout, and you're a facilitator, you need to ask someone to actually control the computer to make sure that the people who are online and part of our online community are actually connecting in and not just sort of left out in the internet, so to speak. So what that means is if you're creating a circle, you actually need to put the laptop in the middle of the circle so that everybody can hear you. Anne is at the door and has programs that Ben spoke of. Can we give our panel one last round of applause, and our interpreters working very hard as well.
Thank you.